Hello, everyone, and welcome to the launch event for the Digital News Report 2023 by the Reuters Institute, focusing on the African media landscape. My name is Federica Cherubini. I'm Director of Leadership Development at the Reuters Institute, and I'm going to be your host for this discussion today. So I'm joined today by Nic Newman, the lead author of the Digital News Report, and Chris Roper, Deputy CEO for Code for Africa, who will help us look at the general findings from the report and from an African perspective. And then we'll have a discussion with three panelists, Mpho Raborife, Managing Editor of News 24 in South Africa, Oliver Mathenge, Managing Editor for Audiences and Engagement for the Nation Media Group, and Isaac Aregbesola, Editor at NAN in Nigeria. So this is a 12th year of the report, which is the most comprehensive study on how audiences consume the news around the world. And over to Nic to take us through the initial findings. Thank you, Nic.
Thank you very much, Federica, and good afternoon, everybody. So as Federica says, I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes or so about some of the main findings as they relate, specifically to Africa. Our entire survey covers 46 markets. We just cover 3 in Africa across 6 continents, and this year we polled 93,000 people. I should just start by reminding people about the methodology. So it's based on online polling. So it will tend to underrepresent traditional news behaviors such as television, print, and radio, particularly when we're talking about sort of cross-platform behaviors. It's also important to stress that in some of the markets, especially the 3 that you see there in Africa, but actually also in India, they're representative of younger, online, more educated, and English-speaking groups. So it's not a representative sample in the same way as it is in other countries. So we just need to bear that in mind when comparing between, say, European countries and African countries. The survey was conducted on our behalf by the polling organization YouGov in January, early February 2023, and our work is supported by 18 different organizations, including a big grant from the Google News Initiative. We have the BBC, NHK, media regulators, industry organizations, academic institutions around the world. And we're particularly grateful to Code for Africa for supporting our work in Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. So one of the key themes that comes out of this year's findings across countries is the fraying connection between news organizations and audiences, and particularly some audiences. And one illustration of that is a question we ask about, how you start your news journey. Do you prefer to go directly, or do you prefer to go via social media or by aggregators or search or other means? And what this chart shows is that over time, direct access to websites and apps has fallen, aggregated across all 46 countries, from 32% to 22% in terms of people's preferences. And at the same time, you see this relentless march of social media as people embrace the sort of convenience and speed of accessing news in different ways. And we haven't seen so much change with search, which remains really important, along with aggregators and mobile alerts, which also are important for some people. But these are averages, and actually we find really interesting country differences here. So I'm just going to compare the African countries with, say, North European countries. So in some North European countries, including the UK, you have these very direct routes still, these connections between brands like the BBC, for example, with people going directly to apps. Whereas in many of the countries that we survey in Africa, we see much more preference towards accessing through social media. So the power of these intermediaries, it seems, in African countries is much higher, and you have to work harder at getting people to go directly to websites and apps. This is just another way of looking at this dependence on social media. So in this question, we're not asking about gateways, we're asking about what is your main source of news? Do you prefer to use social media? Do you prefer to use online news sites, radio news, print, or television news? And we're looking specifically here at Kenya. And what you see is this very clear generational divide. So over 45s and to some extent over 35s still prefer television, still, really, really important medium. But for under 35s, it's about digital media. And for under 25s, it's increasingly about social media. So in Kenya, 45% say that social media is their main source of news. So older, younger. And we see broadly the same splits in Nigeria. If anything, even more the case, 56% of 18 to 24s in our Nigerian sample say that social media is their main source of news. And less than half of that number says that they think news websites are their main source of news. And South Africa, again, very similar numbers again to Kenya. So social media is becoming more important relatively over time. But what's interesting is it's not necessarily the same networks. And this chart shows how Facebook has become relatively less important and influential over the last few years as other networks have grown. This is actually an aggregate of 12 different markets that we've been tracking since 2014. And you can see that in 2016, 42% said that they had accessed Facebook news, some kind of news on Facebook, and that's now down to 28%. Now, to some extent, that is Facebook themselves pulling back from news, but it's also about increased competition from different kinds of networks, particularly those video-led networks. So YouTube has grown this year, Instagram's grown this year, and you can see the black line, the rise of TikTok. Interestingly, Twitter, despite all the upheavals of Elon Musk, in our data anyway, that the reaches remain the same, even though, of course, many publishers are reporting reduced traffic referrals from Twitter as well. If we look at TikTok specifically across markets, and again, this is specifically on news, we see that TikTok is actually the fastest growing network in our entire survey, and the highest usage of it is in parts of Asia, Latin America, and Africa. It's become, it was a significant factor, for example, in the recent Kenyan elections, and the network has become one of the key ways in which political information, political misinformation is now spread. And you can see there, Kenya, 29% of our Kenyan sample said they use TikTok for news on a weekly basis. According to our survey, these are the top social networks in each of the 3 countries that we survey in Africa. So starting with South Africa, you can see the mix of quite an interesting mix of networks for sharing, discussing, consuming news, including Facebook, YouTube, and also WhatsApp. But the biggest increase is, again, in TikTok. So you can see very significant rise in TikTok in the last 12 months. In Kenya, similar mix, slightly different order. WhatsApp slightly more important. And again, the biggest growth in TikTok. So 29% of our sample say they use it for news, up 14 percentage points, which is a very significant change in 1 year. And then Nigeria, Twitter is relatively a bit more important. Telegram as a messaging app is very highly used, and that's grown significantly in the last few years. And then TikTok is not on this chart, but it is there, 17%. And again, big growth in Nigeria this year. So what do we mean, though, when we say people on TikTok or other networks are using them for news? Which sources are people paying attention to in those networks? Is it journalists, or is it politicians, or is it celebrities or social media influencers? So that was a question we wanted to know. So we asked this, and this is what you're seeing here is aggregated data across all 46 countries. And I think what it shows is a clear difference in terms of the influence or non-influence that journalists have in these networks. So on the left, dark blue is mainstream media and journalists. And you can see that they still lead the conversation in Twitter, and they still lead the conversation in Facebook. There is an expectation that mainstream media will be producing news and you will consume news from reputable journalistic sources. But if you look on the right-hand side, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, then people say that they are paying more attention, even when it comes to news, to personalities, which means, celebrities, influencers of different kinds, people that they are following for other reasons who are talking about news subjects. And I think this is very challenging. We can talk about this in the panel, but I think this is quite challenging for traditional media companies to come to terms with a very different kind of environment where expectations are very different in terms of formats, but also in terms of the informality and the sort of entertainment that people expect within these networks. So you may remember last year, a lot of the headlines in our report were about this idea of news avoidance or selective news avoidance. So people who consume news, but also say that they are actively now avoiding news. And this year, we've tried to understand a bit more about this phenomenon, what's behind it, but also what we might do about it. So firstly, just the overall numbers. So if you aggregate across all 46 markets, we find about a third say that they are sometimes or often avoiding the news. So 36% this year, just slightly down on last year. Again, slightly higher in Kenya and South Africa, slightly lower in Nigeria. But what does that mean? What does avoidance look like? What are people doing? So we really find two groups. So one group is just sort of not very interested and trying to avoid all news. And that might be they're listening to the radio and the news is going to come on and they don't pay attention, or they turn it off and turn it back on again when the news is over, or they're scrolling through social media and they scroll deliberately past the news item. This is very much linked to sort of low interest in the news or low interest in politics. We see this in a lot of Western countries. And then secondly, you have more specific measures where people are trying to ration the amount of news, so trying to reduce the amount that they use, maybe by not listening first thing in the morning or last thing at night, or turning off their mobile notifications. Or it could be that they're avoiding particularly difficult stories that make them feel anxious. And a lot of this, I think, is about overload, the sense that the news is everywhere, you can't get away from it, it's depressing, we need a break. And so this comes from people who are interested, but somehow we seem to be turning some of these people away. And just to bring that to life, here's just one comment from people we talked to about this. So, obviously the economic outlook is not very good right now. It's just depressing. I'm looking for something more uplifting, something that gives me a sense of agency, gives me a sense of hope. So we hear that a lot in the work that we do. What stories are people avoiding? What topics? National politics, number one, particularly in Africa. In other parts of the world, it's the war in Ukraine. I think that sense that what politicians say isn't relevant to me, that there's nothing I can do about it. People feel very strongly about that. Crime and security, social justice issues, people turning away from toxic debates is another key issue. And we wanted to know, not just pointing out the problems, but what might we do about that? How might we help? And so we asked people who were avoiding news what kind of news they're more interested in, and they say they're interested in more positive news, or news that isn't just pointing out problems but is also offering solutions. Explanatory journalism, so some of these new approaches that have particularly become popular since COVID, and they are least interested in the big stories of the day and the every twist and turn on each stories of the day. And that's in sharp contrast to people who say they never avoid the news, who think that that's the most important thing. So they spend the most time looking at those stories about national politics or Ukraine. And many news websites and TV broadcasts are basically optimized for that group of super loyal users, but are basically turning other people away. So that's the problem, this one size fits all approach to news, which we've been practicing in the media. And I think that's one of the things that again, we could pick up on the panel and talk about in terms of change. So every year we look at trust and we take the temperature on what's going on. And we saw during COVID people coming back to reliable media and trusting the media more because it was really crucial, a matter of life and death. But since then, we've seen that headline rate decline again, and this year by another 2 percentage points averaged across all of the countries. If you look at the country by country picture, we see that actually the headline trust level in the 3 African countries is relatively higher than countries like the UK or US, where you have deeply polarized political situations where people see things on the media that they don't like. And that's been a really contributory factor to very significant declines in trust in many countries with polarized politics. There are some countries with actually quite high trust where it's not declining, like Finland. So this is not universal. It is a complicated picture, and it is very much attached to what's going on in society and in politics more generally. But one thing we wanted to look at this year for the first time is the link between the criticism that journalists and mainstream media organizations get, particularly on social media, and levels of trust. Is there a connection? And you can see that in this chart, the higher level of criticism that people say they see of the media, the lower the trust. Though this, of course, is only one factor. And we asked our respondents, well, where is that criticism coming from? And the top source of that criticism is actually politicians and political activists undermining the media. And that is higher in some countries, United States, but also Kenya and South Africa. And in many parts of the world, we now see populist politicians with this habit of essentially denigrating journalists, that often criticizing them. It's part of the playbook. And we also find in our survey that social media is where most people see that criticism, perhaps not surprisingly. So that's not blaming social media, but this is one of the channels in which that happens. Of course, other reasons for low trust, concern about misinformation and disinformation. This is a question we ask about how concerned you are about being able to separate real and fake information on the internet when it comes to news. You can see it's highest in Africa, perhaps because of that link with high uses of social media. So people are exposed maybe more to unreliable information. Again, I'm sure this is something we can pick up on in the discussion. Just very briefly on the business of journalism. Again, partly because of the economic downturn, under huge pressure. It's been a pretty dreadful year in terms of layoffs, in terms of closures, and in many parts of Africa, reduced wages for journalists. But against that background, it's not surprising that media companies are really sort of thinking very hard about different ways of getting revenue, especially from subscription or membership or donations. So we've asked, every year we ask people, are you paying for online news in different countries? There are no African countries represented here because of the sample issues that I talked about earlier, would unduly inflate those figures. But across the countries we're looking at, mainly in Western Europe, US, what we see, subscription bump, which has been going on for a few years as publishers have been pushing into subscriptions, generally slowing down. So 17% on average. So the vast majority of people not paying for news and not prepared to pay for news. In those countries where people are paying for news, they tend to pay for one brand, and it tends to be upmarket brands that are doing best. So this idea of the winner takes most, the New York Times being the obvious example, I think over a third of all subscribers in the US are now subscribing to that one publication. So early mover advantage and real commitment and sort of high trusted values are part of what's working. And then we also see lower cost niche subscriptions starting to develop as well, maybe around individual newsletters or podcasts, as well as aggregation. So I think there's some interesting movement going on, which offer an alternative to this sort of big brand subscription option. And I think some of that is going on in Africa too. And then finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about new formats, and then specifically the greater adoption of audio and video, which we see in many of the countries that we study. And to illustrate that, I wanted to start with a slide which looks at the preferences. When you're online consuming news, do you prefer text? Do you prefer to read? Do you prefer to watch? Or do you prefer to listen? And what we see on the left-hand side here for across all 46 markets is people still broadly prefer to read online because it's quicker, you're in control to get the information that you want, particularly when you're in information seeking mode. But then about a third say they prefer to watch, and just over a tenth say that they prefer to listen. That is much stronger with younger people. So younger people are more likely to prefer to listen, partly because they have headphones in their ears a lot of the time. And in some countries, we really see very significant differences. So in India, for example, that preference for watching is very, very strong. In South Africa, it's stronger, and Kenya, it's stronger than it is, say, in the UK or in other Northern European countries where you have this very strong reading tradition. And these are often countries where broadcast and television has been very strong. So I think there's some really interesting positive developments there in digital audio and digital video, which we could be thinking of. And this of course is transferring into what I showed you earlier in terms of that growth, those video networks, YouTube and TikTok. So video led, because it's really easy to consume vertical video on via TikTok. And what you see here is that most of the video consumption is on those social networks, on those platforms, not on news websites, partly because they're beautifully optimized for it, and partly because it's a native part of those applications. That's in general, and this one is specifically for South Africa. So you can see that in the African countries, it's even more to the consumption on those platforms themselves. And then in terms of audio, again, we're not measuring that in Africa because of the sample, but across the countries where we do measure at about 20, we're seeing the growth of audio. We're seeing that younger age profile, that audio is really working with younger audiences. And we see that news is only part of the story there, that people want entertainment in their ears as much as they want news. But news is growing, albeit a little bit slower than the overall market. So I think some interesting positive signs of growth in audio video, which we can talk about. And just finally, to sort of set up the discussion, a recap of what we've been talking about. So firstly, real shifts, I think, in platforms and the platforms people are using to access the news, driven by younger behaviors, which we see a lot, obviously, in Africa with a younger population, and this move to accessible, entertaining, interactive formats, quite often personality driven. And I think that's a challenge for publishers. The sense that negative news, the abundance of news, polarized politics is kind of putting people off and contributing to low trust. What can we do to give people a sense of hope and a more positive agenda, a more balanced agenda potentially? Those real issues, which I don't pretend we have solutions to around the business models. Consumers are looking for value. They're looking for relevance. They're looking for something that's going to be really useful in their lives. And then video and audio are going to become more important, I think, over time, partly because they're really good at building relationships. And we haven't really seen these yet, but I think we will see more successful business models around the video and audio side as well as the tech side. So hopefully some information to get us started on what I'm sure is going to be a really interesting debate. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Nic. For those who joined a couple of seconds after we started, this was Nic Newman, lead author of Digital News Report, taking us through some of the findings on like the general findings and specifically with an eye on the data we have on African countries. Chris, Deputy CEO of Code for Africa. Of course, as Code for Africa, you have an overview across multiple countries in the continent. What jumps out to you in these findings? Can you give us your sense of what you think of this?
Sure. Thanks very much, Federica, and thanks, Nic. I think it's a lot to unpack, obviously, and I'm looking forward to the panelists taking some lessons and pointers from the global data that Reuters has produced and explaining to us and unpacking a little bit about how that can apply in their country locales. But I think for me, the two things that stand out the most are exactly the same two things that stood out the most for me in last year's report, which are the points where the African countries we look at are differentiated from the kind of global averages. So the first one, and Nic has mentioned both of these. So the first one would be the stats about trust in what you can see online. So I think the question that Reuters asks is, if you're thinking about online news, are you concerned about what is real and what is fake on the internet? I think 58% was the average across all markets. The African average, and again, by African, we are only looking at 3 countries here, but I would be hard pressed to believe that this average would change if we included more. The average for Africa is 77%. So Kenya is at 79, Nigeria 77, and I think South Africa is a similar number. So for me, that's a massive indicator of one part of the problem, which is that there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of information manipulation from a bunch of different actors, including kind of foreign states, fake news for profit people and that kind of thing. So that's a very, very fractious landscape for news, I think, in our countries. The other stat is the trust in news stat, where, again, the global average is at 40%, which is down 2%. In South Africa, we're at 57% that trusts the news. Kenya is 60%, and Nigeria, I think, is also at 57%. So we're in a much healthier place, seemingly, than the global average, and then all the other continents that are surveyed. But if you put those two together, there's obviously opportunity and there's threat there. And I think one of the most interesting parts of the study that's been added is about who is causing mistrust in the news and mistrust of journalism. And I when Nic got to that part, I saw every single African panelist nodding in agreement when he spoke about the fact that it's the politicians who are basically stabbing democracy in the back with their criticisms of media. So, and I think those two factors, the fact that we are aware as in our 3 countries of how much fake news, sorry to use this term, it's out of date, how much misinformation and information manipulation there is in our news landscape, but also the fact that we still have a high level of trust in our news. I think both those things are going to inform how we look at all the other aspects of the report, about like the movement towards platforms, about the attack on news by politicians and that kind of thing. I mean, all those, and the business of news, all those things are going to be informed by how we can strengthen our relationship of trust with our audiences. Thanks. I'll hand back to you, Federica.
Thank you so much, Chris. So we now broaden the discussion with our 3 panelists, and Chris and Nic, do jump in at any point, given you have a broader overview, of course. Mpho Raborife, Managing Editor of News 24 in South Africa. We have Oliver Mathenge, Managing Editor for Audiences and Engagement, National Media Group in Kenya, and Isaac Aregbesola, Editor at NAN in Nigeria. Can I ask both the 3 of you, just to give us a sense, like from the findings, is there anything that jumps out to you that you really so resonating from what you see from your countries and your organization, or something that you actually saw playing a different role from where you are? Mpho, can we start with you? What jumps out of the findings?
Thanks so much, Federica, and thanks guys for having me on this panel. For me, I think there is the consistency in being, so what Chris said with some of the data coming out of Africa being slightly different from the rest of the world has been something that I also paid attention to, and the fact that with our trust levels compared to the rest of the UK and the US, they're still seemingly slightly more optimistic on the African continent. And I think specifically for an online publication like ourselves, which exists in an ecosystem with other players, which are largely social media networks who challenge and eat away at what we're trying to build on a daily basis, it really does drive the point home to say the bits that we are doing in the daily job of being journalists and doing the work that we do, the penny is landing in how we are perceived by the public. And so even though the trust scores are considerably decreasing, the fact that we are still being recognized as a trustworthy brand, as a trustworthy place to go and verify, even if you pick something up elsewhere, just to double check that this is actually what's being said, if it's found on News 24, SABC online or ENC online, is really, really something that my newsroom and I don't take lightly. And I think that's a very important note to just let it land, because it means that, it can be a demotivating thing to be a journalist in a society where you're always trying to fighting up against the grain. So I think it's important for us to let that land, that trust score is still relatively positive and is leaning towards us as actual journalists and newsrooms.
Thank you so much, Mpho. Oliver, what did resonate with you from the findings?
Thank you so much for having me here today. And I think as Nic and Chris mentioned earlier, the report has a lot to unpack. But for me, it resonates with the fact that we are seeing a more younger audience in Africa. In Kenya today, the median age is 19. So it doesn't surprise me that a lot of these young people are watching or are consuming content on social media more than the traditional platforms. But also that gives me, takes me to the next question as the media: what do we need to do to ensure that we actually have them consume our content in the way that they want to consume it? So for instance, the jump, almost a double growth in terms of TikTok from the last report to this one, on who is consuming news from Kenya is actually an important figure for us, because we now have to start thinking, do we send our journalists there? Because at the same time, when they asked where they are consuming this content from, they are consuming from personalities. So do we create personalities within our newsrooms to ensure that they are able to give them this content and they consume? And then that now ties up to what they say about how they still have a lot of trust in the media. And so we really we have the goodwill. And so how do we take advantage of that goodwill to ensure that we are actually able to capture that audience and for them to be able to trust us to give them the right information? I think for me, in a nutshell, that's what jumps out for me.
Thank you so much, Oliver. Isaac.
I actually joined it because of trying the connection, but what actually peaked from the little time I joined is, hello?
Yeah, we're having a bit of trouble. We can hear you, but not in a steady way.
Same thing. I'm having that challenge. But can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. Try to go ahead if you can. Otherwise, if you wanna, yeah, we can wait for a moment. Let's try. Give us. Let's see. It seems to be working now.
Okay. Like I said, that this I can. As at the time I came in, what jumped out of it, the resonance is that that as we are looking at it, that for now the content that we give out to the public there matter most, and that we need to give them what we make the news so attractive to the audience, and do everything within our capacity to ensure the trust of the items that we give out. And for not even only that, they followed the ethical principle of the media, of the truth, the fact, the fairness, the accuracy, the integrity, the trust, the timeliness, and the service, giving it out so that people will not even lose the trust in the media. Because as it is, even with the upcoming of the digital media, there is a confusion, a bit as to what to believe in. Is it the mainstream, the digital? But as it is now, that we need to put more effort so as to be able to gain the confidence of the masses in what is being put out into the public. That's just the little I will capture the time I came.
Thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. For everyone, we have a Q&A open, you can see as a function on Zoom. So if you want to start sending us your questions, I will start with some with the panel, and then we'll turn to your questions. I actually kind of want to go back to a question Oliver raised himself when saying, with the switch on some platform becoming more relevant in, like incredible growth of TikTok, we've seen, for example, also like during moments like elections, you ask, while people pay more attention to personalities, should news organization focus more on personalities? And I kind of wanted to get back that question to you. What is your approach from your publication? Does it make sense to focus on creating more of a personality of the journalist to really get into this trend?
Yes, I think one of the things that probably I can mention is that what we've seen is that some of our journalists who are actually on those platforms and actively using those platforms to engage the audience are getting a lot of traction, more than our official channels on those platforms, especially TikTok. We've seen the same even on Twitter, that some of us who are active there with our content and pushing the content from our perspective tend to have more engagement than our official platforms. And so we are actively thinking about how do we use our own personalities who are out there, are known by these young people, active on some of these social media platforms. How do we use them to ensure that they are pushing our content out there? And how do we use them to ensure that they become the conversion to move from those platforms and come to our platforms? Where, for instance, at Nation Media Group, we want to bring back our paywall. So how do we get these audiences to come and pay for content? So we are actively looking at that as one of the avenues of engaging that audience. We're also looking at how can we use what we know as influencers out there, and probably even come together and create content, co-create content with them, or have a revenue share sort of formula that we can use to ensure that we are not losing that audience, because we need that audience, because the older generation, the 45 and above, who are currently watching our TV station, in another 10 or so years, we may not have them watching our TV station. So how do we get these young people either to convert them, or how do we create content that resonates with them on those platforms, and ensure that they keep trusting us as the people who can give them the right information, especially in a country like Kenya, where Kenya, from the reports, people are concerned about misinformation. People are concerned about the criticism on the media, especially by politicians, because we have been victims of it a lot as Nation Media Group, even in the recent weeks, the last couple of weeks. Cabinet ministers going against, or rather trying to trash the kind of work that we do. So we need this generation that is not coming to our websites, that is not listening to our radio, that is not reading our newspaper. We need them to keep trusting us. And so use of personalities, whether internal personalities or influencers, is one of the ways that we actively think that we should pursue.
Thanks, Oliver. Chris?
Yeah, just a quick response to the question. So I remember last year's report, we flagged that TikTok was growing, and there was a section about, should news organizations have personalities to now inhabit TikTok, which I was all for. But Oliver, and this is a question for the whole panel, but just as a response to Oliver, I mean, we've looked at the data in the current report, which shows that in Kenya, for example, only 13% of your traffic will come to your actual news site or news app destination, whereas like almost 50% goes via social. So isn't this the dilemma that, first of all, finding journalists with personality is not that easy, but that's another part of the equation. But once you've outsourced your personality-driven journalism to social media, you're basically driving people away from your own site as a destination, from your own kind of hermetic brand values as a destination. I don't think we shouldn't be doing it. I think we need to work out a relationship with social platforms that allows us to thrive in some way. But I mean, do you see, and Mpho and Nazi, please do jump in as well if you want to. Do you see, like, is there actually a resolution to this dilemma, or are we just in a holding pattern here where we're trying to get as much traffic out of the social media platforms as we can because we know we have to be there, but we have no end game in sight? Well, yeah, what is your take on that? And Mpho, I see Mpho wants to answer that as well, so
I can
if you'd like to hand it over to her.
Thanks, Chris, for that question. So there's various ways to answer this. I think one of your panelists, when you launched the DNR, said something like, these sites are like an unfaithful boyfriend or something like that, where you like, you know, sometimes they let you down and you have to, you wonder what you did wrong. And I agree with that panelist because, Chris, we, unfortunately, as you would know, half of 60 million South Africans that are in our country are under the age of 39. So we're a very young continent. We have to meet them where they are. We cannot try to turn people into what we'd like them to be, because at the end of the day, we are also providing a service. We have a product that we are selling, and they are consumers of that product, and they are putting trust in us, giving us money to keep doing the job that we do, over and above the civic role that we play in our democracies. So for me, it's important for us to find them where they are, build a relationship with them where they are. We don't have to be, no one knows how long TikTok's rise and journey is going to last for. But for now, that's where they are, and that's where we need to meet them. My class, I'm at Oxford for a fellowship, and we found it so funny. One of our panelists was one of the TikTok people who run the TikTok account, and she was explaining why their handle on TikTok is "We Are a Newspaper," because some people would watch content from that account and think that it was someone whose name was Washington and their last name was Post. So there's also that we cannot assume that everybody knows what we do, who we are, and that people are just consuming content on different platforms, but knowing who News 24 is, for example. So it's also our part to be humble and educate people and not walk around thinking that people know what we do, what our role in society is, but it's on us, the imperative, to always reach them where they're at and bring them the content that they need, and to be that brand that they can associate. Oh, okay, so Breaking News First, which was our previous logo, Trusted News First, you know, we are a newspaper. Those small ways of trying to touch base with a person are very important. And to what you were saying about personalities, just before I get on that. So with an end goal, for example, we've decided to stop posting on Facebook, but we're still diverting our resources towards Instagram and TikTok, because that's where we see growth. So we redirected our resources from our audience engagement team. And that's a long game. We're just trying to build a relationship with people so that they know there's a brand awareness and a trust level, trust relationship that we're building there. And it doesn't have to show ROI in 2023, 2024. It's a 5-year, 10-year long game. And if it crashes and they go somewhere else on a new platform, we'll follow them there. But in terms of personalities, I wanted to jump in because I think what you said is very important. Journalists want to naturally be behind the scenes and tell you the story. Not everybody wants their face known. At the most, they want their name and surname known, and that should be good enough. So you as managers as well in newsrooms, it's very important to identify who to try and experiment with for what purpose. So there will be people that are comfortable engaging with readers through comment sections, whether on our own platforms or on these platforms, to build that relationship where readers feel like, okay, so I know who Mpho Raborife at News 24 is. They just put this article up and they're responding to a question that I have. And then there are those who are less shy and are free to read a script and speak to a lens that's going to be on TikTok and be the face of their story, take ownership. So from a leadership perspective inside a newsroom, I think it's also important to read the room and gauge who's keen on what, where their strengths are, what they're comfortable with, to try to play a part in us reaching people on these various platforms. That's what I wanted to add on that.
Thank you, Mpho. Another aspect that the report highlight as something challenging for news organization is that some of the people that either disengaged with the news and are have less interest, like lower interest level with the news, or decide to selectively engage or disengage at different times. Part of that, part of the reason that they say is like this idea of like, they want to look for something more uplifting. They are depressed by the news. They are overwhelmed by the news. But as journalists, a lot of these are the very things that either drive the news agenda or that are part of the things that, as news organization, we used to cover the most. Maybe Isaac. I think Isaac is having a bit of trouble with his connection. But Oliver, to you, how as a news organization can respond to this request of more uplifting news when news sometimes grim?
At times I hold the view that at times audiences don't know what they want. And so at times we have to give them what we believe they need. And so for me, I believe that we can strike a balance. At the same time, there are those who really still want to be informed about what is happening, and we can't push them away. But in the sense that there are those who are saying they want this kind of information, probably uplifting information that is valuable to them in terms of does it have value in terms of how it helps their lives. I think we have to invest in that kind of journalism. I think it's not hard for us to invest in that kind of journalism. So I think in Kenya, especially, speaking from a Kenyan perspective, is that what we've been accused of is concentrating too much on the politics. And so probably looking inwards is that we actually need to start thinking what other kind of stories our audience is looking for, and how can we give them that kind of audience, that kind of content to them. It's not that we are actually not publishing that kind of content, but at times even how we have optimized our websites, how we are sharing the content, probably is they are not discovering that content, that it exists. Because at the same time, we find that most of the traffic that is coming to our websites is on the political stories. So they are asking for one thing, but they are not getting it. So how can we actively optimize our platforms to ensure that this content is discoverable for our audiences, and ensure that we create more of that content for them to be able to consume? Because I believe that we still have to tell the sad stories of drought. We still have to tell the shocking stories of corruption in Africa. We can't run away from those stories. And so it's about how do we strike that balance and ensure that the audience gets what they want.
Mpho, you want to react, and then I saw Chris had something to add, but I wanted to ask you, while you react to that, a second part of this this thought, of course, of how to strike that balance is also that websites are often over-optimized for the super loyal users, which in many cases are also those who are contributing by paying, either because they're loyal users where they're paying with their attention, or they're paying with reader revenue. So there's also a question in the chat that's asked about how do you bring together this need of reaching wider audiences, being able to speak to those new people who are turning off from the news, while also remaining super serving some of your most loyal users who are contributing to your financial sustainability. How do we strike the balance?
So Federica, thanks for that. I wanted to jump in because I wanted to give the listeners an eye into our what we've done at News 24. So one, like Oliver said, you have to be intentional in how you rejig things, and you work around the content that you have, because it's not that the content's not there. we took a conscious decision to create a beat called Climate Future. And in that beat, we've got a solutions tab. So that's one of the ways that we are being intentional in making sure that the newsroom is going to pay attention to this particular beat. And in that beat, we don't want to depress people even more by always continuing the state of the world and what's doom and gloom, but we want to help them help themselves. And we found the same thing with the business beat, with people wanting content that's going to help them. Yes, there's a cost of living crisis. Yes, things are tough, and people have to watch how they spend. But the other part I wanted to bring in was listening to our readers is very important, and we all know this in the room, right? We had an instance where people were telling us in the comment section how depressing our stories were. South Africa is in a very depressing environment right now. We are heading up to national elections next year, but there's a lot going on that would warrant anybody feeling very doom and gloom and gray. And we took a conscious decision from hearing those comments to make sure that we had a good news day. We experimented with it last year. It was one full day on April Fool's Day, where usually news sites would run jokes or fake stories as the past tradition. And we flooded our stream with good news only, good positive news. The only thing that wasn't positive on the day was either something breaking or exclusive. And we're trying to do that every single year. I'm trying to get our newsroom to do it on a monthly basis. What happens is everyone in the newsroom, a newsroom of about 108 people, if you can just find one positive story to write, and we publish it on a specific day. And the thing is, Federica, that I wanted to add is the comments that came on the day that we experimented with that, people said that their mood changed for the rest of the day. It boosted their outlook. And so we also have a responsibility when someone is saying something to listen and then be creative in how we tweak things, because we still want them around. We still want them to know what's important, but we also still want to give them what they need, because this is a relationship. And on a monetary aspect, I really think that media rooms can tap into this, because there's really, I think there's room for collaboration, because brands also want to be associated with something that's positive about the country, positive about society. And so I think we should be a little bit more creative in how we're weaving that into our top 10 big stories that you need to know.
Thanks, Mpho. Chris, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure when news sites became therapists. And, like the only reason that we would want audience to come to a news site is to read the news that matters. The reason we have all the other framing rubbish around it is because we need to raise the revenue to pay for the news that matters. There's got to be another model, which doesn't mean we have to do some fake good news, which in South Africa is normally made up because we haven't got a lot of it going around. I mean, there's got to be a better revenue model which allows us to do the stuff that people actually want news sites to do. They don't want news sites to do, top 10 lists of best places to eat a Gatsby or something. I mean, the other sites that can do that much better, right? The only reason that news sites venture into those territories is because they're trying to subsidize the real news. So kind of what worries me a little bit that we are, it's like the outsourcing our personality to TikTok as well. Those things worry me because it means like you're kind of fundamentally undermining what we want to do with news. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely believe that we should be doing proper news on TikTok as well. I'm not saying ignore TikTok, but it's like kind of like, when are we going to kind of understand that the battle to be everything to all people was lost quite a while ago, and maybe it's time to rethink business models in a way which allows us to do the news part and focus on that.
Absolutely, and I wanted to link to something else you said, Chris, before, in that this ecosystem and this environment. One of the things that really jumps out is that with high level of concern around misinformation and false narratives, a lot of that around media criticism that comes from journalists, from politicians, also creates a very challenging situation for news organization and for journalists that in many cases are attacked or harassed for their work. But can I ask you, what do you think, how can news organization navigate this environment while providing, their accurate and trustworthiness news, but also standing up to criticism? What do you think is the position of a news organization in this landscape?
Thanks, Federica. So we actually had a very recent example of that, and Chris mentioned it in our country focus in the report, where we had a news reporter, legal journalist, taken to court by a former president for doing her job, which is writing about court proceedings, which she was involved in. And for me, what's important beyond a company news organizations putting their weight behind their staff and employees and protecting them from start to finish, because the purpose of this story being out is because we're doing our job in society, is this industry coming together. So it's very fragile in our time. We're a 29-year-old democracy right now. We're going to turn 30 next year. Like I said, we've got national elections, which means our political coverage is going to be even more ramped up, which is probably going to make a little bit more news avoidance and people getting depressed. But we're hoping that the approach that we use doesn't drag people away, but it gives them a sense of agency that maybe they can play a part in helping to turn our country around. But what's important when politicians are coming into the space and discrediting us and eating away at our integrity and our credibility is for us as a fraternity to back each other up. So it's very important that we be seen as a united force, because we are serving a purpose in our democracy and our society. And I think that's one step above being fully behind monetarily, emotionally, and in terms of staff support. Over and above that, as a fraternity, we need to be one unit, because you harm one person, you're harming the whole collective, right? So it doesn't matter that it's News 24's journalist who was attacked. Tomorrow it's going to be a journalist from the Daily Maverick, and the next week it's going to be from the Mail and Guardian. And that's what will eat away at their, in a small ways, but it will chip away at what they're trying to achieve if we stay united as a collective. And that's what I would like to see getting even more and more stronger. It is right now with our friends of court processes and all that, but I just think that that's what's going to counter this.
Thanks, Mpho. We've answered actually quite a lot of the questions in the chat about platforms and audience connection, personalities. But Oliver, there is a question around audio format. And someone who believes that the news is not really embracing audio as it could, despite the growth of podcasts in Kenya and Africa at large. What is your view on the growth of audio, and how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I think what just to mention, just to what the previous conversation about politicians, I think I totally agree that as an industry, we have to come together and ensure that we protect each other from, especially the politicians. And this is working well in Kenya. As I mentioned earlier, about a few days ago, we had this cabinet minister who was attacking the nation, and every media house got behind it and supported the nation and supported journalism and defended journalism. And that's what we need to ensure, because what we are seeing is a trend where these, especially the politicians and the political activists, are taking advantage of those spaces and using them to discredit journalists, even when there is nothing to discredit in the content that has been actually been provided for by journalists. To go to the question about audio, is that I believe that we need higher investment in audio content. We have been very strong on radio, continue to be strong on radio in Africa. And that means that there is the capacity to produce audio content that especially resonates with the younger generation. Because podcasts are being consumed by the younger generation. And for us to be able to ensure that we do this is that we have to ensure that we produce quality audio content that they can actually consume. The other thing is we need to think of how do we mainstream audio stories, even using traditional platforms. For instance, what we've done at Nation Media Group is we have some podcasts that we are also running on our radio station. They go digital first, but they also end up on radio. And that has helped us in ensuring that we are able to produce enough audio content that resonates with the audiences. So I believe there's still a lot of room for us to explore the audio space, and it's up to media houses to actually invest and see it not as a waste. I talked to some editors around Kenya, and at times they feel that production of audio takes away a lot from the newsroom in terms of the capacities of the newsroom, in terms of the resources in the newsroom, where they need more people to write more text and not produce audio. But for me, I think it's the opposite. You need more people to produce what people are consuming and less of what people are not consuming.
Thank you so much. We are at time, but I wanted Nic to get back to you with the last question. We have in the chat someone who asked that how small newsrooms with less resources that have a lot of financial constraints, how can they implement some of the great ideas that we heard from our panelists today?
Well, we've heard a lot of concern for big newsrooms, struggling with change, really, cultural change and changing formats and listening to audiences. I think, one of the huge advantages of small organizations quite often is that they can be much more in tune with a specific group of people. Chris was talking about, just focusing on doing one thing and doing it well, your values. And I think small newsrooms can do that really well. And it's not about reaching 1 million people or making huge amounts of money. But I think that's one of the things digital has given us is that ability to have new perspectives and tell stories in new ways. So actually, that's one of the things I'm most hopeful about, is seeing entrepreneurial, often 1-2 people, and actually, I think if we haven't talked about artificial intelligence, but the next wave of innovation, actually, I think will enable very small groups of people to do a lot more through combining technology and great values in journalism. So I think if I was a small organization with a lower cost base, I'd probably be in a stronger position than some of the sort of the bigger media companies that need to, maintain bigger audiences on really very, with large wage bills. So different challenges, I think, but different opportunities too.
Thank you so much. I want to be respectful of everyone's time and finish on time. But I wanted to thank Nic and Chris, of course, for helping us look at the big picture, and Mpho and Oliver for bringing their perspective. There is a lot more. As everyone said, we just unpack a couple of things. We could have kept going for another hour and unpacking more. For the audiences following us, we have the full report on our website in different chapters. I go deeper on some of these themes, and we have a podcast also series in which we interview some of the authors of each of the chapter to help us guide the finding. Thank you so much for following us today. Thank you again to our panelists and to Chris and Nic for joining us, and to all of you for following along, and have a good rest of your day.